Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a new episode of Black and Beautiful Chit Chat Connections. It is a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm so excited for our topic. As you know, we have a guest, and our topic is at the bottom of the screen. We are talking about restorative justice today. Is restorative justice restorative? The question is really simple, but we are going to hash it out with someone who is legit on the ground trying to, do the best for our young Black and brown boys in this country through education reform. So it is a pleasure for me to introduce you guys to our guest, Ellijah McLean. Woo! If there was like a background, you would hear the crowd screaming. So, Ellijah, how about before we go any further, you introduced yourself. Oh, before we do that, I do want to say welcome back. This is season 2. I'm so happy that you guys are back here with us on this DEI journey. We're here trying to get righteous, trying to get equitable, one episode at a time. So, Ellijah, tell us who you are.
Hello, everyone. And thank you for tuning in. This is a very wonderful channel. Charlene's doing some really great work. So that's really awesome. Thank you for, again, tuning in. My name is Ellijah McLean. I'm currently a policy and program analyst for United Way Rhode Island. Specifically, I work in education policy, so both K through 12, college, and as well as adult education. So my life is really pretty much education based entirely. But I'm from Providence, Rhode Island. Yeah, I'm from Providence, Rhode Island. And yeah, I'm just very happy to be a part of the channel. Super excited to talk to Charlene about some work.
Hey, I'm super excited to have you here. I just want to go through a memory real quick. I said to myself, I worked with Ellijah at one of my previous institutions that he graduated from. And I remember as he was going through his days, volunteering his time, working on education as a major, we had a conversation. And I said, Ellijah, you are going to be in government or having your own nonprofit addressing issues on education reform for our Black and brown children one day. And who would know that I prophesy that over you? And here we are at the age of 25. You are an associate for policy reform. This is crazy. At United Way, by the way, which is a nonprofit that's a huge, huge national brand on policy reform in this country. Can you believe this?
Truthfully, I must say I can believe it because a lot of the work, you've witnessed it. You've been a part of those long days of planning, the long sessions, the long, professional development days, everything. So it's just been magical that I feel like it was all God's timing and that it worked out the way it did. Simply because I put a goal forth that, at first I was teaching. I enjoyed teaching. Again, I love education through and through. So when the opportunity to work in policy, I just wanted to have a larger impact on communities that I'm particularly from. And, so when the opportunity came, I really stuck to it. And I'm just grateful that I'm in the position I am now and that I can still have impact on, larger communities, but also get back to the communities that I was from. So it's been a very true blessing.
This is just super lit. I'm very proud of you. And you addressed Congress recently, correct? You were on television. So I got someone famous. I got a famous guy on my show, guys. This is so exciting for me. Just congratulations to you. I know you're going to be doing great work in Rhode Island and for the rest of the nation. So thank you for being on our platform. Guys, I'm going to go into what our format will be for today. So as you guys know, some days I have formats, some days I don't. But generally when we have guests, we try to keep it formatted so our guests can feel comfortable and be, their authentic selves on this professional platform. So our format for today is restore what, restore who, and fall back, fam. Okay? Now, I came up with this because I feel like there's a lot going on with restorative justice. I have some stories for you guys, but let's just get into it. I wanted to let you know what the format was, so we're just gonna kick it off. So restore what? So I want to give you a little background to what restorative justice is. As you know, on Black and Beautiful Chit Chat Connections, we give you resources. We're going to look at some definitions, we look at data, and then we analyze those definitions and data, right? We're not just pulling these things out of the hat or out of our hind parts like everyone says. Everyone has a hind part, so everyone has an opinion. We have opinions based on facts. So we know that Wikipedia is not that great of a source, right? But for illustrating this lens, I went to Wikipedia and I looked up what restorative justice means. So according to Wikipedia, restorative justice is an approach to justice where one of the responses to a crime is to organize a meeting between the victim and the offender, sometimes with representatives from the wider community. All right, so I feel like that's straightforward enough, right? So I went a little bit further and I found that the University of Wisconsin-Madison's law school, which, by the way, the University of Wisconsin-Madison is a very prestigious school in this country, and they hold some traditional ideologies when it comes to race and culture. Nevertheless, they describe restorative justice as a set of principles and practices that create a different approach to dealing with crime and its impacts. Restorative justice practices work to address the dehumanization frequently experienced by people in the traditional criminal justice system. Instead of viewing a criminal as simply a violation of a rule or statute, restorative justice seeks this as a violation of people and relationships. So, today, we will specifically be focusing on restorative justice in our education system, i.e., K through 12. All right. And how it's been affecting our little Black and brown boys and young Black and brown girls and those who are non binary. Now, according to an article in Education-topia, an arm of the George Lucas Educational Foundation, they describe restorative justice as it empowers students to resolve conflicts on their own in small groups, and it's a growing practice at schools around the country. Essentially, the idea is to bring students together in peer-mediated small groups to talk and ask questions and air their grievances. Now, that was a lot. I just threw a lot at you. So me and Elijah are going to kind of break this down for you and give you a little bit of insight into what we've seen, because our feet and ears are to the ground, baby. So, Elijah, let me ask you first. What are your thoughts about the definitions that I just gave about restorative justice? Could you just talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. I think the definitions you gave, the first one, the Wikipedia one, but that was broad, very broad, not super specific, again, on the communities that are greatly impacted. And I think the two separate ones that you provide, especially the one from I want to say from the arm of the that
Mhm.
that one is much more, I guess, comprehensive and more thorough. But again, it doesn't necessarily address the actual communities that are really targeted for restorative justice practices, or, for example, the quote unquote students who interact with those practices more often. There's very disproportionate impacts for students on the ground. And especially, again, your Black, Brown, your BIPOC students, your Latinx students, those are going to be the students who are experiencing the interactions of restorative justice more often. But we're going to talk more about that later on. So I would argue that the
Yes.
first definition was broad, and the second and the third one were a little bit more thorough and kind of get to the point. But
So it's very intentional, guys. As you know, if you've been watching this platform, you went through season 1. I am super intentional when it comes to drawing up a lens. The reason why I chose these is because, as we see from Wikipedia to Madison, Wisconsin, to Wisconsin, Madison, I always interchange the name, law school, we see that restorative justice seems to be synonymous with criminal behavior. And then we're taking that lens and we're putting that lens into our K through 12 systems, whereas Elijah so eloquently just shared with us, most impacts our young BIPOC, Latinx communities. So why would we be using a lens that is supposed to be utilized in criminal justice reform? Why would we be using that for children? I'm confused by that. So we're going to use this platform to chew it up. Because me personally, I don't know about you, Elijah. I don't know if you were ready for this piece. I personally do not co-sign. I do not sponsor, co-sign, I do not support restorative justice in K through 12. I feel like it targets our young people. And I'm going to get into the rest of it a little bit later because I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself because this topic is too juicy for me. Okay?
Of
So
course.
I just wanted us to have a conversation, like, because I already made my stance before we go into the rest of our conversation. So I want to know what your stance is on restorative justice.
Yeah, I think in one particular settings, environments that could be more diverse, that's including a multifaceted demographic of wealth, class, race, gender, ethnicity, etc. It can be very fruitful if it's gone at from basically like a trauma informed standpoint, not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily addressing a quote unquote conflict or etc. You can do that in a way that is productive for youth, that gives them skill sets to identify these issues, challenges, traumas, experiences that they're having. But you don't necessarily have to do that from a lens of like, as your teacher, this really hurt me when you did this, etc., which I think happens in most restorative conversations, which again isn't a bad thing. It's really great for kids to build that skill of empathy, but it's
Mm-hmm.
also really important for students who have experienced the most trauma, who are very resilient. Again, they're survivors day in and day out from some real situations. And so to put that pressure on a child to feel sorry for something that they did when it's just a reaction, it's a trauma response, it's something that is very natural and organic for them based upon their lived experiences, I think that's very problematic. And of course that seeps into the experience of BIPOC students in classrooms. I've experienced it as a young adult, I've experienced it as a child, as I've experienced it as an educator as well. So the idea of restorative practice and restorative justice, I think, is a really sugar-coated way for oppressors to feel affirmed in what they're doing because it's a conversation. So I think there's ways to go about it, and in environments that are going to be very diverse, inclusive, and again come from a trauma informed standpoint, then you can have truly restorative conversations. For example, if you had a conflict with among your colleagues who are not, they could be from your similar demographic, but they have the same they're educated, they understand these things. You can have a very informed conversation through conflict. You can't necessarily do that in a situation where you're not being affirmed, where your setting is not welcoming, where your setting is not inclusive. You can't even have those conversations because there's no trust. And I think in a lot of school settings, it's very difficult for youth to build trust with educators who are not affirming them through every situation. So again, there's ways that it can be productive, there's ways that it can be supportive, but there's also very disproportionate effects for communities.
I mean, I, you know, if you guys don't see why this guy is working on policy work, then I don't know. Okay, that was so eloquently put because me, I was like, it's BS. All right, I can't stand it. All right, I owe it. I owe restorative justice. I owe its practices. I find it to be so targeting. The reason why I find it to be so targeting is, like you said, the oppressor gets affirmed in their offense. It is not a young person. I, for the life of me, don't understand why people don't get this. At the fundamentals of a young person in youth development, when they act out, it is because something is wrong. An adult has failed them somewhere. Take the time to get to know our young people, man. Take the time. Stop labeling them. But anyway, any additional thoughts on restore what? I
Uh,
think go ahead.
no, yeah. I was going to say again, in when people are properly educated, trained, like professionals in these things, I think it can be very, again, restorative, but it comes from the standpoint of the facilitator, comes from the standpoint of the, if we're talking in a school setting, K through 12, it has to be administration to your custodial workers because they interact with kids. All of them interact with youth. So if they're not coming from a restorative justice standpoint that is solely based in rectifying and addressing trauma that youth are experiencing, again, we're not asking everybody to be a trained clinician, a trained social worker, a trained psychologist, none of that. No, we're asking educators and people who are around youth to be informed on these things just so that they can, again, through your morning interaction with the first person you see at school, that needs to be welcoming. That needs to be, in a sense, restorative because you never know what that kid's coming from. And you want the school to be able to develop them and, to create young civic, young, strong-minded, capable, educated youth. Again, you want kids to have fun, and they can't do that in environments that are not informed in their traumas, that are not informed in their best interests and best practices. So again, it's not inherently a bad thing, but it is very unfortunate when you see predominantly white institutions address these issues through a restorative lens that is not actually addressing the real root of the systemic problem that probably made this interaction, situation, conflict even possible.
Right. Restore what, guys? I feel like as time goes, you know how words start to evolve, theories and ideologies start to evolve, applications of theories and ideologies start to evolve. I really hope we move away from restorative justice as our framework to address systemic issues and address the trauma that our young people are experiencing because of other systemic issues that are outside of the education system. If we learned anything just now, restore what? Like restorative justice comes from a criminal justice lens. Why are we using a criminal justice lens to address young people's trauma? It's sick. It's truly sick. And I'm sorry, I know that you're saying that if it's applied properly, it works. I disagree with you, but I disagree with you in love because I'm that big mama bear and I'm like a pit bull when it comes to the education system and our young people. So I'm sitting there like a roo roo. I'm ready to pop off at any time. So I don't agree with it. I know that I feel like we need a youth development lens. We need to look at young people in their development stages and treat them as such. Why is it that when we're addressing young white students, we're looking at them from a youth development lens, but when we're addressing young Black and brown and Latino students or BIPOC students, we're addressing them with a criminal lens? It needs to stop, and it stops with us, the people who are on the ground. We need to say, look, we're not using this lens anymore. Sure. This lens doesn't work.
Sure. And what's great is literally just yesterday I was in a conference by Dr. Renad Betis. She's out of the University of Pennsylvania, and she does work. I want to say she's a clinical psychologist, but she also works in public health primarily, and she works in K through 12, and in literally trauma-informed practices, but addressing conflict, addressing school SRO officers, school psychologists, school counselors, etc. And it was a very informative talk, but from that talk, she just affirmed what we ultimately know as educators, as supporters, is that restorative justice practices and your traditional school settings are, again, punitive for BIPOC, Latinx, Latino, for students of color in those settings, simply because they're addressing conflict and aiming to deter deviance, not from a lens of helping the student get through their traumas, address these traumas, and apply wraparound services for that kid. So, for example, the services that are provided through restorative justice are usually punitive. You're disruptive. You're impacting education loss by saying, this conversation, we've had 5 restorative justice conversations with you. Now you're going to be suspended or etc. And now you're going to be reprimanded, which will obviously impact education loss, ultimately deterring from the ultimate goal of educating and equipping children, youth with skills. So, when you're coming at it from a wraparound services of like introducing students to addressing their traumas, being welcoming, being supportive, but also, again, actually giving them the skills to improve, the skills to ultimately help their families socially mobilize. All of these things impact youth, whereas restorative justice practices literally just address a quote unquote conflict in a friendly way for oppressors without really affirming youth at all. But I would also argue, though, in settings where, like, I could be again with my friends from college, and we could be in a very heated conversation, and I would argue our resolution, because we've developed these skills, is truly restorative. It's through a sense of love, it's through a sense of educating. But again, that's possible, but you really have to buy into that. And when school environments don't buy into that, it becomes a practice that is going to be deterring of youth entirely. So it's very tough. But I've been in some professional settings where, I couldn't wait for a restorative justice conversation, because white person or a person of power, or oppressor, for using that language, did something, and I was like, yeah, this is now the setting that I can get back. This is the appropriate way for me to address this person and affirm myself. So again, I think for children it's very disruptive, but for some adults in professional settings, it can be managed and used a proper way. But with the proper supports, schools don't even need restorative justice practices. All teachers should be able to manage a conversation with a child, and without harming them socially, emotionally, physically, anything. Like, there's no excuse to be made for an educator. Children are children. We're aiming to develop and educate them. It doesn't matter if you're in your most troubling conflict district. Those kids are still part of that district, and you're committed to teaching them. And entirely restorative justice practices put a band-aid on a larger issue, when in general we should be addressing that issue and starting the process of rebuilding and supporting that kid, so that, again, these issues don't continue to surface for them.
Agreed. Well said. Well said. Takes us into our next segment. So I'm gonna calm down because I get too hype. I get so excited about this because I am someone who, if you guys have noticed, I'm very passionate about this stuff, and I want to close out on Restore What by saying I just recently did a workshop called a DEI related workshop called Words Have Meaning. And I just did another one called Framing Your Work. And so restorative justice practices is a framework that's applied. The word restorative or restorative conversations, those are not synonymous with each other. So when you're talking about having a restorative conversation with a group of adults or young adults, that is not synonymous with the framework and practice of restorative justice. And I want us to understand words have meaning, frameworks play themselves out. Frameworks are legit mini systems that are used to address policy issues, policy and procedure. So we need to understand this at its fundamentals, or else we're going to continue perpetuating harm in spaces all over this country. We need to address these things head on. And so that takes me into Restore Who. Now, it wouldn't be a Chit Chat Connections episode if I didn't give a lived experience story. I mean, come on, guys. It's story time. You ready for this, Elijah? So, I'm going to share a story about when I was recruited to become a restorative justice coordinator for a predominantly white middle/high school. So, after I give this story, I just want you to respond, Elijah. Okay. So, like, you don't know this story ahead of time. So, Elijah is responding to this story live and raw. Okay. So, I'm really excited for this. So, I interned at a high school in the state of Maine with an amazing athletics director. Awesome guy. Shout out to you, Mr. Fuller. That's my guy. Okay. Me and Mr. Fuller, right, encountered some things that where we saw young people now in Maine, especially in this particular town in Maine, this particular city in Maine, excuse me, there is a large Somali population. Now, if you know anything about New England, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, they were all sanctuary states for Somali refugees about going on 15 years ago now. So being an asylum state means that they had resources for those communities and for those communities to gain economic and social mobility while they were in those states and became American citizens or green card holders. So this particular city had a large Somali population, and there was like a line down the middle. It was like white folks, Somali, right? And so we know that our Somali community is tribal, and they come with their cultures from their country, and they keep to that. So even those their own social politics played out within their own communities, but everyone went to school together. And what I found was the nurturing piece of that community was basically null and void. Now, Mr. Fuller is amazing, but he's a man. Like men are not nurturing by nature, but he cared about the community. Now, the nurturing piece where it would come from, like having time to develop them and having time to listen to their stories and having time to do all those things, it was spread thin because a lot of we're always low on staff. There's always a lack of resources. So anyway, I'm making this long story short. There were a couple of times where the little kids got out of hand in front of me, and Mr. Fuller was there, and I went to check in the little kids. I check little kids, okay? I don't like no rude little children. I do not like that. I cannot. I don't like a little rude child now. I'm a check a child. I don't care. So I checked the little child. But I also shared that the reason why I had that kind of clout was because I was a Black woman. It was like they knew that, hey, this Black lady, she not playing with us, so we can't talk back. There's a privilege that comes with that, and I shared that authentically. So fast forward, they wanted me to become their restorative justice coordinator because they seen these instances where I was able to check the young people and the young people knew where to rub their mange, okay? And then after that, they would love me. Oh, Miss Shar, and they'd look forward to me. So it would be, of course, they would want me to be their restorative justice coordinator. So I go through the interview process and I ask them a couple of questions. And so listen, guys, if anything you learn, please know that when you're in an interview, you're interviewing them too, okay? They want you just as bad as you want that job. So I asked them a couple of questions about their perspective on restorative justice. And I'll give you two questions I asked. I said, okay, do you take the community approach? Because there are approaches to restorative justice practices. Do you take the community approach where you also involve the entire community in the restoration of relationships with the student? Or do you take the approach where, like how we talked about earlier, where there are punitive measures? I did not use the verbiage punitive, but I asked along those lines, are we just focusing on the young person, or are we focusing on the community around the young person? And I got mixed reviews. I will say in this moment, transparency, I completely bombed that interview on purpose because I was like, there's no way I'm coming here, because I would be miserable. I would talk back to y'all. I would tell you guys about your nasty habits, okay? Because they were more interested in blaming the young people for their trauma responses versus educating the community on how they could better serve the young person. Mm-hmm. So I literally, Mr. Fuller knows this, but I literally bombed that interview on purpose. And I was like, I'm not going to y'all funky school. Sorry to all the little kids. You know I love the little kids. I don't have a problem with the children. But when I see adults okay inflicting harm on young people because they never want to take accountability for their actions, I run the other way. Mm-hmm. All right, so that's my story. I literally pretended like I literally, I purposely answered questions wrong. I purposely fumbled the bag because I didn't want that bag. All money ain't good money.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So my one initial reactions is I'm not surprised at all that you had that experience. I'm really not. And I'm also not surprised that you probed the questions and you put them, not even in the hot seat, but you put that critical lens that nobody was probably applying before. And being in that environment physically as an educator also, like I saw that and I experienced that, and but that's also the reason why we do the work that we do entirely, but in settings that allow us to do the work. There's someone of course who needed that experience as that, restorative justice coordinator, whatever. There's the right person for that, and you happen to not be the right person because your lens is much more critical and larger. They weren't ready for you. They simply weren't ready for you. And that's unfortunate, but a lot of that region right over there is not, and that's very unfortunate. That's super unfortunate, but I'm not surprised at all. And being in predominantly white environments, regardless if it is an elite institution, a public school, a low income environment, you still experience very similar microaggressions, very similar, restorative practices for youth that are, again, punitive. No community is necessarily doing it well when there's lack of diversity. I've actually seen classrooms that are restorative justice based that, like you mentioned, the community standpoint. So if there's a youth, like literally little kids who are feeling away, they raise a flag, and there's a conversation that's had in the classroom to support that student among their peers, with their educator, with a counselor potentially, depending on the situation. But over time, they lose the flag, and you actually can internalize, they have an oath that they say, to calm them down. It's a full thing. Again, that takes a lot of commitment. That takes a lot of buy-in. So there's ways in which that we can go about community care and community support. But again, that school, they just weren't ready for that. They simply weren't ready to have that community standpoint, because for a lot of schools, they look at it as that child is bad, that child is deviant, that child is, that kid's the problem, that kid's the problem, without ever placing a critical lens on themselves. And most educators don't have to have certification, have experience in any type of trauma response at all. Most of the time, your typical four-year institution for majoring in education, potentially, depending on how progressive your institution is. I was grateful enough to have experiences like that, but a lot of educators in low-income environments, again, so for example, where I work, Providence Public Schools, there is a huge deficit for educators right now. There's a huge shortage, but there is no track for degree certification in trauma-informed practices, in early education. Again, these are very low-paying fields, so they don't even certify the work. They don't even validate educators in these spaces anyway. So they are literally setting up youth for failure without having these programs, institutions in place. But again, that's why we do the work. That's why it's very important to have the data behind this, because the data does not support restorative justice in schools for youth. I was just reading an article, because I had to literally just produce testimony for this on trauma informed practices this week, and I was, again, blown away, but not surprised, because as a Black man in predominantly white classrooms, and even diverse classrooms with educators who did not understand trauma, who did not understand youth trauma responses from K-12 and in college, like all across the board through my years of education, this has happened, and it's super critical. So ironically, I'm not surprised to see that black youth are predominantly the ones being impacted by this. Black women, young black girls are the ones being statistically impacted the most in these situations. And so it's very disruptive and destructive for communities, because you are literally setting youth up for failure and not restoring any community at all.
Anything.
And it steeps into, again, you're impacting an individual right now, but later on you will be setting them up for failure to negatively impact their community. So a lot of these practices do not allow youth the opportunity to socially mobilize and do not put families in this position to socially mobilize. My younger brother, very different than me in school, very different socially than I was. Amazing young man. A lot of his friends are amazing young men, but they did not have the academic opportunities that I did. They did not have the social opportunities that I did. That again, I would not say that if they had restorative justice practices in their school, things would have been different for them. But if they had trauma informed practices instead of the restorative justice practices that they experienced, then I think a lot of them would be in a different situation now. So I would argue, the restorative justice practices are really a way for oppressors, for educators to put a little band-aid on an issue.
Yep.
Yeah.
And center the feelings of the oppressor.
Yes, entirely.
Yeah.
When in
I'm
general,
over it.
there could be again a way to educate, a way to affirm educators in the work that they do by just giving them these supports, by giving them these skills. Most educators love youth. Most educators, I would not say that educators hate their job and do this, for the pay. There's not a lot of money in it. There is some truth behind educators loving what they do, buying into it. I think a lot of them are burnt out and a lot of them do not have the supports to actually or the skill set to support these kids. So I don't blame educators entirely. I blame, lawmakers. I blame the institutions that do not equip these educators. Like
Yes.
imagine you don't take 4 years of education training in your undergraduate year or wherever you're receiving certification. You can literally be a teacher. You can be like Teach for America and
Mm-hmm.
receive like a summer of training, and that makes you a teacher.
Right.
There's a lot of ways in which that we are failing youth and setting them up for failure, and also setting up young adults for failure by putting them in these environments that they are not going to succeed in, and ultimately hindering an entire community in the process.
I'd like to argue too that, Teach for America and all of these teaching certification organizations that are trying to give, like, where are they sending those teachers that they're teaching, they're training for a summer? They're sending them to the low income communities that
Yeah,
are suffering from lack of everything of the all of the above.
yeah,
And so it's like, but you wouldn't send that to an affluent community. You
no,
would require that the person who's teaching in an affluent community to have a master's degree and have been taught for the last 6 to 10 years.
yeah,
Like, it be trained for the last 6 to 10 years. We're
yeah,
getting a little bit off topic, but this is how nuanced and deep it goes,
yeah,
right? And I want to say shout out to right now there's a rumors of a mass exodus of teachers in America. That is a national conversation. Teachers are leaving at alarming rates. I mean, just picking up and quitting in the middle of a quarter of a semester, whatever the language and terminology is for your institution. Shout out to all you teachers out there who haven't left our young people. Shout out to all you substitute teachers out there who are working and trying to pick up the pieces. Shout out to all the administrators and all the people who are like, I'm not going to give up on the youth, man. Like, and I'm not saying that the teachers who quit are giving up, because I know I've been in such toxic environments that I couldn't take another second of it.
mhm,
Shout out to you for doing what's best for you. But I just want to especially highlight those who are still there right now. Please don't give up on our young people. We got to make this better one step at a time. And I really believe that, like you said, Elijah, it's super important for us to push on our legislators. Like, I don't know how much we have to bang this in the head. It's not about the presidential voting. It's about your lawmakers. That is your local state lawmakers, city councilmen. You need to vote for them. As a matter of fact, the new ballot's coming up in a couple of months. You should be researching right now who you want to vote for.
mhm.
Like, this is important. These are the people who are making the laws that you and your family have to adhere to, have to operate in. It's very important for us to notice as a community, but as a nation on the whole, because I feel like this lack of knowledge and lack of access to this knowledge, it permeates past, people of color. You know, white folks are a little bit more political when or have more political conversations because they hold political power in this country. But I know even some white folks who are just focused on the presidency as well. If you align with equity and righteousness, put people in place who are going to pass laws and legislations that align with your equity and righteousness. It's just that simple. Because right now it seems like we have a plethora of legislators, at least, and I'm not trying to say this as a generalized statement, but you know them by their fruit. A lot of our legislators are passing laws that are just in favor of themselves or those who fund their campaigns. And it's not about the people. So I need us to really be aware and cognizant of that. But let's go into this. Who is restorative justice really for? All right. Let's look at the stats. So Chalkbeat, who reported a study conducted by the RAND Corporation on the evaluation of the impact of restorative practices in mid-sized urban districts, they stated that 12.6% of schools who were established in restorative justice programs, students were suspended at least once, compared to 14.6% in schools who implemented their restorative justice programs by the end of the second year. So those students were suspended at least one time from the 12.6% schools. Those schools implemented their restorative justice practices immediately. Then 14.6, right, in the second year. So what they're trying to say is that teachers reported that their school environments felt safer because the policies appeared to, excuse me, in addition, teachers reported that their school environments felt safer, but the policies appeared to be especially unhelpful in middle school grades. So they found that it didn't reduce suspension rates, but it did hurt their test scores. The shift did not boost student learning on the whole, and Black students in particular actually saw significant reductions in test scores. As well as Black students saw bigger declines in suspensions due to the program, though they were still more likely to be suspended than white students. All right, guys, so what we're seeing here is that we're starting to see the fact that you want to implement these restorative practices. Students are getting suspended less, but their test scores are being hurt. So that means that the restorative practices are in fact harmful to them, because that means that now they're not focusing on their academics because they're so afraid that they're going to go through some restorative practice, right? Like, I bring this up because the administration was not that long ago. So during the Trump administration, overseen by Betsy DeVos in 2018, a federal report was conducted in which Child Trends, which is a nonprofit organization that analyzed the federal civil rights data collection, and they analyzed from 2011 to 2016. Okay. And in transparency, they caution that this analysis, which is based on numbers self-reported by schools, can't cover every possibility. But the findings did say the following: Black high school students were twice as likely to be suspended as white, and that's 12.8% to 6.1%, or Hispanics at 6.3%. And students with a disability were twice as likely, 12.8%, to be suspended against those who did not have a disability at 6.9%. So we're seeing that Black students and those who have disabilities are 2 times more likely to be suspended, even with these restorative justice practices. Now, in transparency, these were self-reported numbers. So this data was aggregated and they're looking at this from self-reports, okay? So I want to give you guys a definition of what urban schools are so you could get a clearer understanding. Urban school districts, the definition is a method of schooling that takes place in a large, densely populated area with diverse populations, okay? It refers to situations and demands that characterize teaching and learning in large metropolitan areas. All right. So, in other words, we're discussing people who come from historically ignored groups, because as we know, urban populations, metropolitan populations are more likely to have people of color in a dense space. Okay. Would you agree with this?
Yes, entirely.
Okay, so Tell us a little bit about your experiences in the education system and how this has affected our youth. So we see some data, right? We see three different data. We saw that those who implemented their restorative justice practices in the first year had about a 2% decline in suspensions. By the second, those who did it by the second year had about a fraction of a difference in their suspensions. Then we saw that Black students are more likely to be suspended versus white and Latino students. And we saw that students with a disability were more likely, twice as likely, to be suspended versus those who did not have a disability. And this transparency comes from a federal data that was aggregated from 2011 to 2016. So with that data, and we know what urban schools are, with that data, like what have you seen in the educational system and what do you feel? The third data was the test scores. They noticed that even though suspensions went down, test scores went down as well. So what have you seen, and like, can you give us some insight into the statistics that we were able to share just now?
Yeah, I'd say again, as my time as an educator, I've seen students who are resilient in their day-to-day lives, of course, but in some moments, they do express a trauma response. They may, I would never want to say lash out because I just think kids are energetic, but they may have done something in class that was disruptive or seen as problematic, etc. But most of the time, critically, educators are one teacher to a classroom for 20 plus students, and it's very difficult to manage all of that, frankly, every day. There's a lot of stressors in classroom settings, but I would argue too that predominantly BIPOC, Latino, Latinx students are significantly monitored more in classes, literally watched more in class, so that literally contributes to the act of we need to have a conversation. We need to talk about this. Again, kid could just be being a kid, still learning per se, right? Still not being a deviant or disruptive student to their own particular learning environment, let's say. But overall, again, students are monitored, students are tracked, students are seen, and in those settings, they're gonna be punitively like reprimanded. Of course, you have in-school suspensions, you have out-of-school suspension, you have even these conversations take time. You're bringing in parents, you're bringing in consultants to talk to students, all this, when in reality you're actually not addressing the root of the issue that could be a systemic challenge in your district or in your school. On top of the fact that this kid has a numerous variety of stressors and obviously is going through something.
I don't
So
mean to cut you off there, but can you give us an example? I want to ask you a question really quickly. Can you give us an example of what a systemic rooted issue in a district might look like? What would that look like? How could that manifest?
yeah, I would say one, a systemic issue could be the lack of diversity in educators. The lack of diversity in educators who can sympathize and relate to students in general. So, for example, I, as a Black man, didn't experience a Black educator man until I was like a senior in high school. And that's very problematic to me, of course, in understanding that I can then speak to an educator. So your experience in the town you were talking about, you were probably one of the only educated Black women in their school system that they have interacted with, besides like the TAs, maybe. Again, not saying that they're not educated, but they're not their full teacher. So
Yes.
for you to be in a position of power, of authority, a leadership role, they could relate to you regardless if you were hard on them, regardless if that was a conflict, quote unquote, a situation of tension. They had that connection to you. They could relate to you entirely. So in school environments where children don't relate to educators on a one-to-one level, you can't do this. You simply can't have restorative conversations. So I would say, again, I've seen kids who are, when I've been a teacher, and they're being disruptive because they need that attention. But
Mm-hmm.
once I take them outside into the hallway and I talk and I'm like, hey, what's actually going on? We have bigger conversations, and then I'm able to rope in, a parent, someone who supports this kid at home, someone who could support this kid in another classroom, creating those wraparound services. So I would say I've seen, conversations where it's not done well, where it's very punitive and where also school districts blame parents a lot. school districts really blame parents when they don't understand that the systemic issues that exist in this parents' lives, they may be working several jobs. They may be unemployed right now. They may be trying trying to pursue career certification, professional development, and they simply can't. There's so many obstacles that are systemic for parents that then seep into their kid. And then they're at school also experiencing systemic issues of lack of curriculum that is diverse for students. Curriculum that has been always geared for middle-aged white youth skills and test scores. So, trying to fit a round peg into a square hole when in reality you could be improving that learning environment for all of those kids who are from a particular demographic, instead of trying to adhere or achieve these ridiculous standards where they're literally just pushing kids along on top of developing no social skills. Again, I do not blame the teachers. I do not blame, I blame the district. I blame the leadership in this, because they could be implementing strong practices that are proven to work. We know the solution in so many different sectors. We know the solution, but the jargon, the egos, all of
the
that,
bureaucracy, just too much. It's convoluted. But you know what? I don't know. I come from a different era, and we were scared of our teachers. I just remember there was always, growing up, in primary school, there was always one kid who, would have to sit in the corner because they was bad. They was a bad kid, right? But we didn't want to be the bad kid. There was only one bad kid. No. You know what I mean? And that bad kid had like their own teacher who would be with them. But most of the time, that young person wasn't disruptive in class unless something was happening to them. And it's like the community knew it. So even us as peers would be kind to that young person. You know what I'm saying? Or at least try to, because, little kids have jokes and they mean and stuff like that. You clap that, but I always remember being scared of my teacher. I was very outspoken in school though. And I was called disruptive a couple of times because I would chat back. But God made me this way. It sucks, right? But I got A's in school. So yeah, I clap back. You mad, but I get A's. So that didn't matter, right? But I'm saying all that to say we were afraid of our teachers, and our teachers knew how that classroom management, they had that down pat. I don't know where things got, where the disconnect happened.
Yeah, things are bad now. Like, as someone who was
awful.
I was just teaching high school seniors recently, and youth, public, private, charter, doesn't matter. Youth are running schools right now. The power is in youth. And unfortunately, again, as someone who was just in school as well, you see it because there's strength in numbers. And frankly, students are very, very, very educated. They're very
savvy. They run deep. And they be like 50 deep. After school, it's crazy. You see them walking home from school and they're deep. They rolling like with little gangs. It's weird.
Another again, real problem too, and one of the sources that I would like to plug in also is like the Surgeon General just released. There's a public health crisis right now for youth. There's a public health crisis when it comes to mental health issues, when it comes to depression, stress, anxiety, and simply, for schools that are implementing restorative justice practices, we're already seeing the very bad negative data, the sharp data points that are not proving that it's working. So as we're coming out of the pandemic life, again, some people think we're still in, some people don't. Regardless of where you lie on that spectrum, we are all coming out of a very traumatic situation. As adults, it's difficult to grasp. As parents, it's tough to grasp. As wealthy, poor, broke, however you want to identify, we're all coming from a very hypersensitive, traumatic experience of loss, oppression, racism, systemic racism. Some of us check off every one of those stressors, every one of them. Mm-hmm. And imagine how kids are also seeping, how that's impacting youth. So I would say, like, from the conversation, like, to really read up on the Surgeon General's report, the reports that are showing, again, that policy should be led with this mindset now, because youth will not be able physically be here. There is a lot of very troubling data that is shown right now about how youth are experiencing mental health crises and challenges, and it's disproportionately impacting Latino, BIPOC, low income communities, and then seeping into low income communities of color. So there is like tremendous data out there that is showing why policy should be led on this. And so I feel very grateful to be in the work, but it's also every day seeing it. It's like these are no brainer issues. There are
Yeah.
no, but like, these are blatant rights that
Yeah.
people should have access to. So
Absolutely.
when you ask the question of restorative for what, for who, it's to me, sometimes it seems restorative for some politicians. They get to champion a bill, they get to say, they get to pull out the data that they think is important. But again, if they're not addressing that education loss, if they're not addressing that learning loss, if they're not addressing the traumas, if they're not, another challenge too is that it takes time to show change. It
Right.
takes time to prove change with data. So when you're dealing with youth, of course, it's very difficult to show the quote unquote change that a program was able to do when you simply can't equate your program to this child's full development
Mm-hmm.
unless you're fully submerging yourself in that child's development. So
Right.
I've got a lot of challenges, and but that's why I like the work that I do, and it allows me to research a bunch and ask questions, and it's also allowed me to have conversations with superintendents, the leaders of SEL, the leaders of restorative justice practices in the district and for the state, and most of the time those individuals are white, and sometimes that's an initial barrier that I face, because I'm like, I don't ever want to make any assumptions about you, because I would hate for you to make assumptions about me. But I
Right.
also know that you're a leader of the district, and you can see this data the same way that I can. And does it impact you the same way? Do you care the same way? Are you driven the same way? Because you seem
Mm-hmm.
very complacent and comfortable with this data. So
Absolutely.
it's for sure sometimes a double-edged sword to be in. But again, it's it's restorative in itself for me, because it allows me to feel affirmed in the work, and also know that there are some very great, powerful, and influential people who came before me who did it. So I feel
Right.
so empowered to do it. But restorative justice practices, I don't know, we got to work on that entirely. We really got.
We really do, guys. As you hear it from someone who has his boots to the ground, his ears and his feet to the ground. He's 10 toes down on some Nipsey hustle, guys. Like, this is real stuff. Like, we really having a real conversation. And I hope that you're walking away from this conversation with a new lens and a new perspective. Parents out there, we are in the education field. And we see the side of your child that you don't see every day, because we spend a lot of time with them on that front. And I suggest, I don't care how long you are at work, I don't care how tired you are, keep an eye on your children. Do not expect these schools and these teachers and administrators to raise your child for you. Your child is your responsibility. As you heard it out of his mouth, he didn't say this, I said this. Half the time they could care less about our children, especially the children that look like us. Keep an eye on your child. And most importantly, some of you young people out there might be mad at me if you watch this. Tell your child to stay off of TikTok and Instagram for so long. That stuff is making them depressed, because they comparing their lives, okay, to an avatar. They're comparing their lives to a fake Instagram reel, to a fake TikTok post. They don't even understand that the algorithm is literally predatory towards them and showing them this stuff because it wants them to click on it. It wants them to feel that way. It wants them to long for merchandise. It wants them to long for a BBL and big chiclet looking teeth. Come on. Come on. Keep your children off this social media and give them their own self esteem. I don't mean to be preaching right now, but it's down in my soul. Parents, watch your children. Our children are our future. They literally are our future. And that is why they are under attack right now, because it seems like they want to exterminate us. Okay, they already talking about population control. They're already talking about things are too populated, all this bunch of stuff. And I know you can say, oh, here she goes with conspiracy theories, but they're not. We have the data to prove it. Okay, watch your children, man. Restorative justice is in your schools, whether you like it or not, and they're looking at your children as criminals. They're looking at us as criminals. Watch your child, man. Keep them off the internet, bro. That TikTok thing and Instagram and even this YouTube. There's some righteous people out here, but most of the content is created to make someone want to be something that they're not. And when your child is growing up, you guys remember this. Go back to being a child. Don't be a tainted adult. Think about your innocence as a child. Once that was stripped from you, you were more susceptible to trauma. You followed trauma around. Protect your children from the crap you went through. I didn't mean to go on a tangent, but I feel like it needed to be said, bruh. And if you made it this far in this video, that means that was for you. Period. So anyway, I wanted to also say one more thing. I remember working at a nonprofit organization that was for runaway homeless youth. And I was working with an individual who brought all these trainings to the organization, and he thought he was so smart and so great. And I showed him a picture of my 3-month-old nephew. Now, my nephew, little Indian looking boy, he got a little straight hair, you know what I mean? He looked like a little coolie little boy. You're not supposed to say coolie. He looked like a little Douglas little boy, you know what I mean? Soon as he laid eyes on my nephew, 3 months, he said, he looks like a deviant. Who thinks of a 3-month-old as a deviant? Now, I'm going to tell y'all right now, I quit that job. I was only there for 3 months because I was going to slap fire out the dude. I really was going to fight this guy. So I decided to quit because I'm not about to work with somebody who thinks my nephew looks like a deviant. But I was crazy when I was younger. I have since matured. But still, this is the lens that some people are. And I'm not saying all white men are like this, all white folks are like this. I just happened to have this experience with this white man who was supposed to be working with runaway homeless youth. Think about it. And he looked at a 3-month-old black boy and thought he was a deviant. This stuff is ingrained. You indoctrinated and ingrained in this. Half the time, I don't even think he even knew he said that. But I asked him, I was like, you think a 3-month-old looks like a deviant? You know me, when I was younger, I was ready to pop. So ask my mama. Hey, listen, my mom's going to be on our show. She going to pray for us. I'm telling you, ask my mom. I told her, I said, Mom, if I don't quit this job, I'm going to fight that man. And I'm going to go, I swear. I said, I will fight him. Because at that point, he had enraged me so much. He had enraged me. Some of our young people are walking around enraged because people have been harming them over and over again, and there's nobody there to protect them. And then you wondering why they acting out. They're enraged. They're upset. They're mistreated. They're not seen. They're looked at as deviants. They don't stand a chance. They got grown-ups arguing in front of them about critical race theory and about just teaching them and affirming their identity. People legit are telling our young people that their identities don't matter. Blatantly in their face right now. That didn't happen when we were coming up. When I was coming up, that this conversation wasn't happening like this. I didn't have the internet timeline to see what adults were talking about. Protect our kids, man. Protect our children, B. That's gonna be a hashtag. Protect our children, yo. Not in the what's it called? During the Trump administration, the QAnon, not the QAnon. Protect our children. Literally protect our children. Anyway, guys, as you can see, I get heated. We get heated on this podcast, man, because I just feel like we could do so much better as adults for our young people. It's our job to protect them, yo. It's our job to protect them by any means necessary. We can't be so selfish in the way we navigate anymore. We have to protect our young people. Ask Elijah. He know what time it is. Elijah see me full blown in work. He know I'm not just talking. I'm about this life. I'm about that action from New York City, baby, all day. So I don't play these games. I live this life. Just know, any mom out there, any parent out there, if I was working with your child, best believe while they was with me, they was protected. When I left, I don't know what happened. But when they was with me, I made sure that they were protected, their mental, physical, and emotional health was protected, and I was a safe space because I felt like that was the least I could do for my community. So I implore you, all the teachers out there, all the administrators out there, if you have the opportunity to protect a young person mentally, physically, spiritually, emotionally, you a righteous, equitable person, please do so because our kids need you. They need you, B. I didn't mean for this to turn into like a call to action, but I feel like it's appropriate since we're talking about this subject to really implore all of you to do your due diligence in your own sphere. Don't feel crippled by systemic structures that want to place a barrier in front of you. Push through that barrier, protect our young people because they really need it. They really need it. And Elijah, you keep doing the good work on Capitol Hill, bruh.
I'll keep trying. Yeah, we've got a pretty big event next week that I've been coordinating. We've got the Day on the Hill event where we'll be showcasing and advertising two policy bills that are supporting after school program and funding for communities, creating comprehensive, high quality after school programs, that for youth that can be academically engaging, athletically engaging, emotionally and psychologically stimulating for youth. So I'm really looking forward to that. The governor will be there. He'll be speaking. We've got some of the senators and representatives who are sponsoring the bill. And of course, we have youth speaking. So that there's nothing more special to see the youth that you interact with. I personally don't get to interact with them on a programmatic side now, but I get to help, organize and oversee and interact with the directors of their programming and stuff. So I'm really excited to get to see youth in a very formal setting, but control the environment because it's the house of the people. So it's really important. It's really special to see individuals who are the work's done for them. So when they're there, and I'd also like to shout out moms, of course, and all the parents and the providers here who tune into the channel, and just again individuals who are surviving every day, who are resilient, who are fighting, and who are making it happen. Understand that as someone who represents myself and my community, but also someone who does the work now, I truly see that there are individuals who really care, who care about the community. But again, we don't know unless you are advocating for yourself and speaking out. So I would encourage you again, wherever you're tuning in from, go to your state house, go to your local officials because they want to hear you. They don't want to hear from us all the time. They really don't. Because I come at them with the numbers, with the data, and I beat them over the head with things that they already know, frankly.
Right.
But when individuals who are community members, who are advocate, who are survivors, who are resilient, when they share their story, that's what sticks with them. That's what sticks with these lawmakers. That's what sticks with these elected officials. So please feel affirmed already that you survived your day, but also feel affirmed that your community really needs you. It's a voting standpoint, but it's also advocating. Get out there and don't be ashamed. Do not be ashamed because I'll tell you, it's in front of Congress and senators and reps and all that. They are regular people. They are regular people just like you and I. And they just happen to be in a position of power.
Right.
That's really it. But they are
you put them in.
Yes, that you put them in. They are regular people. They make mistakes.
They regular schmegular degular.
Regular people. So
shout out to Cardi B for giving us that regular schmegular degular.
So stand up for yourself, use your voice because you're powerful. You're powerful.
Right.
Regardless of what you do. So again, shout out to the moms, shout out to the family, shout out to the youth. Stay strong, stay golden, stay blessed, stay beautiful. And Charlene, this is amazing. Like you're doing such great work. I'm truly
but we're not even finished yet. We got a little bit longer. Hold on with us for a little while longer. Because that's what we got the fallback fam section.
Oh.
Fallback fam. Now I've been telling them to fall back this whole podcast. Now listen, this segment of our podcast is for us to throw out ideas about education and how we reimagine reform, right? Or imagine reform. The above was to give, the audience some guidance and a means for some additional research, because you can't just start talking about stuff without giving people some facts, right? Like, we're not out here trying to give opinion, we're trying to give facts. So I say fall back, fam, because we need reform in ways of representation rather than additional harmful policies. You know what I mean? So fall back on trying to dictate our young people's trajectory. Fall back on trying to steal our young people's destiny. Fall back on putting our young people in pipelines and making them go to prison for the prison industrial complex. Fall back on treating our young people as if they're idiots and they're not smart when they could run laps around you if you actually gave them an opportunity to do so. Fall back on treating our young people like they're some sort of outcast because they dress different, speak different, have a vernacular, and they have a little swag about themselves. Understand where they come from. Understand their cultures, their ethnicities, all of the pride that comes along with their nationalities that might not be from what your background is. Fall back, fam. So, Elijah, I know you always laugh because I get real New York on it. I just feel like, what are your thoughts? What's your fallback, fam?
I'd say my fallback, fam, is stop thinking you know all the answers because you're in power. That's one of the biggest things, I think. I'd also say fall back on being so quick to group youth into categories that money creates. So for example, youth are not statistics; they are individuals. They are a part of communities. They are empowered. So I would argue fall back on the stats surrounding achievement, quote unquote, without addressing the real problems in classrooms. So you're basically saying an entire community, neighborhood, district is undereducated, underserved, etc., but without really addressing any of the parts of the systemic things. I definitely say fall back on blaming parents, fall back on blaming individuals who are, again, not at fault. They are just simply conduits of their environments. They have been made this way simply to fail. And so stop blaming individuals for this. It's just not right at all. And I definitely say fall back on individuals who are marginalized, feeling like they are powerless. They want you to feel powerless. They want you to. But know that there are individuals who are advocating for you. You just speak up and they'll be there. So yeah, fall back on all of that. Fall back on all of that. And
all the above. Fall back on all of the above.
all of the above. All of the above.
Yeah, man. You guys heard it right here. Fall back. Fall back, man. Fall back. Because it at this point, we're starting to see how it's a detriment to our young people if, the suicide rate is up and young people are severely depressed and the data is cringeworthy. Like, yes. It's just not working. So it's time for us to fall back. So I'm gonna close. I want to close out with two questions for you, right?
Sure.
No, I'm gonna close out this section with this one question. And then when we go into the closing, I got one more question for you. Okay, so this last question for you. What can we do as fellow citizens working in tandem with you as you go before Congress and go before our representatives on Capitol Hill to combat what we have so eloquently discussed in this episode and help you advocate for policy reform and representation within our school districts?
Yeah, I'd say one, an informed population and informed constituents for politicians is very powerful. For politicians who move in the shadows, who kind of lurk, who have very policies that are embedded with a lot of disproportionate outlying, adverse effects or outcomes for communities. We all need to be educated and informed, but also being able to reach out to the individuals who are advocating on behalf of you. So you don't necessarily need all the answers, but you need to explain and articulate what you're going through so that lawmakers and policymakers know. That's it.
Right.
Again, they know these issues exist, but until we put their feet on the fire, until we actually tell them this is an issue right now, 85% of the community needs work. 85% of the community needs food, basic needs access, etc. They won't care. They simply won't move on it. There's things that, and what really matters is getting your story out there because it influences budgetary things. Without there being strong support from the people who really need it, simply it falls on it, they don't care. Sometimes they simply
Right.
don't. It's unfortunate. For example, a bill that for in Rhode Island to increase minimum wage to like $15 or something like that. That bill was introduced 10 years ago. We needed that 10 years ago. And again, I'm not saying that doesn't get moved because there's not support from the community, but there's so much strength in numbers, and majority of us are suffering, and majority of us, I would argue, are surviving every single day. We need to band together. We need to articulate. We need to organize, But again, there are people who are organizing on behalf of us who are only getting a segment of the story, a fraction of the story. And I see it even with my organization. We're doing tremendous work across the state. During COVID, our 211 center was the hub. The governor was saying, call 211 to get all these wraparound services. We connect individuals. We are the middleman for supports for families in Rhode Island. That's very important. But again, we are still just getting a segment of a fraction of the research because we're working with particular communities who are reaching out to us, and we're trying our very best to branch out. But again, advocate for yourselves. Speak up.
Right.
Do not be afraid, to think of what the person across the street is going to think of you because they're probably experiencing the same thing. If you're not in the 1%, you're or the top 40, top 50, you are in the below demographic. Your neighbor is probably going through the same thing as you. So, I think there's a real stigma behind advocating for yourself, and like if you're low income, people don't like to say that they're on social services. I understand that for sure. There is some stigma behind that, but a reality is a lot of the country is, So again, it's knowing that you do not need to be ashamed of your situation. It's just more of you. If you want to get out of that, if you need that real systemic support, then you need to be able to advocate for yourself because there may be someone not advocating for you. That's simply it.
Yeah.
So getting out of that shell of, feeling like you are not capable, feeling like you don't have the voice or the power, because literally you could walk into the State House and testify on a bill. It just takes that access of knowing the website, the research and stuff. So again, reaching out to your local officials, reaching out because without you, I don't know what's going on. Without people who are literally living it and experiencing it, I don't know how to inform. So it's really important that the people get their voices heard and out there. So I would 100% encourage, following your elected officials on social media, tweeting at them, messaging them, calling, emails, going to the local state house, your city hall, your town council meetings, and being a PESC, being a voice, advocating for yourself. Don't take no for an answer. Because it takes time for progress. It takes time for change, and especially for policy. Like a bill could be passed and it's supposed to be enacted tomorrow. That does not mean every institution is going to follow that bill at all.
Exactly.
It takes time. So if start advocating for yourself today, so you can hopefully see that change. And if you don't see that change, then you need to make that change. And you need to make that change with your community members.
And be that change. You guys heard it here first. I mean, I reached out to Ellijah on a whim, like, man, I need you on our podcast, and we're going to talk about restorative justice. And just like that, he was on the ballot before Congress talking about the same thing. These themes are coming up still. People probably thought restorative justice was a thing of the past. It is current. This is a current conversation. So just think about all the ideas that you have in your mind about how you can see your community become better. and find out when they're talking about these things and follow the direction of our wonderful Elijah. Elijah, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us, bruh. Like, this has been such an amazing time. You are so eloquent. I'm so happy. I know the audience is just so flabbergasted with the way that you are doing your work, and, just gracing us with your presence and your intellect has been just a pleasure. So I just want to thank you so, so much for joining us. Is there anything that you would, and guys, I don't know if you see at Ellijah McLean, right? Like, if we need to get in contact with you, your Instagram is attached to your name right now. So people could just go ahead and follow you or DM you. How would you like for people to get in contact with you?
One, there's Instagram and Twitter. Also, I wasn't really using LinkedIn when I was in school. I was kind of upset that I didn't do that because LinkedIn is a productive version of Instagram. Like, it is a safe version of Instagram for those who
And
feel.
Facebook.
Of course, so LinkedIn, everything's streamlined. It's all Ellijah McLean. So please feel free to follow. I will follow you back. I'm not one of those people who is like weird about ratio stuff and all that. So I will follow you back, of course. Yeah, but this has been such an awesome conversation and opportunity. One, it's great to have authentic conversation around these issues, because a lot of the times you have conversations in, let's say, professional or work environments or those settings, and sometimes you hold back because you're afraid of that tension, but you're afraid of also the restorative conversation that needs to come from addressing the real issue. So it's always great to have forums and platforms like this so that we can speak authentically about the things that we experience day to day, but also the real issues that our youth are experiencing. So I feel very blessed to have the opportunity, and I can't wait to have more conversations on the channel, on the platform.
Oh man, this is so great. Guys, you guys already know from last season, this is a professional platform with an authentic twist. You just heard it. We had somebody pull up on us and they're like, oh, I get to be my authentic self and I get to be intellectual and share my insight with you. That's exactly what we want on Black and Beautiful Chit Chat Connections. Hence the name. I mean, come on. Like, we're chitting, we're chatting, and we're making connections. Thank you so much. You heard it from Elijah. You can totally catch him. Sorry, guys. Look, too authentic at this point. My eyes are tearing. You can catch him at Ellijah McLean on all of the social media platforms. Our contact is also here and it will be down below. I'll also put Elijah's contact information below, and any additional resources that you guys might think you need or would like to engage in, please go to www.imanaborenainc.org and you can get in contact with us there. It has been a pleasure, guys. I mean, like, you guys don't understand how much I love talking to you. I love being on this platform. And guess what? Until next time, peace and blessings. May God bless you and heaven smile upon you. It is Black and Beautiful Chit Chat Connections. Shalom.